So from our three speakers, we got a common theme that I actually find quite disturbing, and that is the issue of disconnect. All three of you gave examples, gave ideas, gave historical practice where the view from US foreign policy and the actual experience in the region are heavily disconnected. And if we're going to move forward in constructive ways, we got to find some way to have a look at this. But what I would like to do is just to get this discussion going, I want to hit the speakers on this with just a few comments, and then we'll open up to the wider audience. But Roby, I want to start with you, because you had one of your points halfway down a slide was a lack of experience back in DC. And Guy, you talked about this as well, we don't have these hardcore mid-managers in space. So for the region to be expressing its views, its positions, its desires, its wants, its knowledge, its information, how do we do that if we're conveying it back to individuals that don't have the experience or might not even be in the job? I mean, what would be your advice, Roby, to the region on how to get that message across?
Well, let me put it this way. 40 years ago, as a foreign service officer, a young foreign service officer, I came out here. And I went to Yemen. It was a really fun place in the early 80s, Yemen. هذا كان مش نهاية العالم لكن ممكن نشوف النهاية من هناك. Okay, get it? Wasn't the end of the world, but you could see it from there. Yemen was a tough place. And I look back at what I knew here and understood. And I'm shocked that I had the responsibility I had. Okay? So the way I learned is I found the older guys that were some 20 years older and some I liked and some I didn't like. But I found the older guys and I talked to them about everything. Ron Newman, the former ambassador to Afghanistan, and I had a long discussion in Washington, and he said the one thing he's focused on is historical context, understanding in historical context. And so I think that's really what's missing. That's what I'm pushing. I did all the Gulf briefings for the Middle East operations course of all the military coming out here during the Iraq War. Probably 10,000 over the thing. I did it, they paid me next to nothing, but I went down there and did it religiously because I think that the only way we begin to understand each other is to go back in that historical context and understand that the UAE didn't happen yesterday, that there were the Nahyan, El Maktoum, there was Sharjah, there was whatever, and that these structures, these traditional structures in the Gulf predate, many of them predate these Western ideas that we've tried to foster on people. And so I think that's what's missing because it begins in the educational process and this Western conception that there has to be a Western-like state. And then when you take it into modernization theory popular in the 60s, the professors that have been teaching people democracy, that economic prosperity leads to democratic institutions, et cetera, I just don't think that's true. I think it depends on the socio-cultural construct, and that's what we have. But that's not what we're teaching, and so by the time they get there, you've really got, relative to the numbers, you've got a handful of people that really understand the context, in my view, and that's the problem.
But Alberto, from your position, from sitting in the State Department for many years, you're in a position where you're hearing from the region, you have some knowledge about the region, we talked about this last night, but yet foreign policy has a political agenda. So the context is important, but the US goals and objectives are just as important to the United States. How do we balance this necessity of knowing the context, knowing what your partners need and want, with the US's own intentions on what it wants to do in or for the region?
Well, I think there's a rule of governance, maybe not everywhere, but I've seen it a lot. I think it's true in the United States that, and I'm not referring to this administration, the more senior you are, the less you know about the reality on the ground.
Good.
And you see that. The person in charge in the Obama NSC for 3 years, during the rise of Daesh, or led to the rise of Daesh, had no Middle Eastern experience. He's the person in charge of the Middle East, had no Middle East experience. He was an expert on Europe and Turkey, but there's no accountability in the Washington elite about basically that person being in charge. The person who, did the rapprochement with Cuba was a former failed fiction writer. But he happened to be very close to President Obama, so he was in charge of that. Didn't speak Spanish, maybe he ate at a Cuban restaurant once, but he actually didn't know anything about Cuba. So the people who know are not necessarily going to be the people who decide. That's always true. It's always going to be true, and there's always that tension between the person who has the specific knowledge on the ground, who has that insight that you're talking about, and the decision makers. There's always a gap, and there's always a trade-off in trying to convince decision makers this is important. And by the way, it's a problem, and it's been a problem. I remember 20 years ago in Damascus, a very senior academic coming out and people we did an event, and we had people who said the region is going to blow up. This was 1996. And this very senior person who was in government, who's now in the Council on Foreign Relations, said, it's not. These regimes have been in power forever. There's no revolution occurring in the Arab world. These are actually very stable regimes. That was true. And then one day it wasn't true. So, this tension, this idea of people not knowing and knowing, that always exists in government.
But I just want to go to you, Guy, though, on your point, with the social media element especially. So we have people that know and some people that don't know, but everybody can get on Twitter and claim to be the expert. And so going back to our opening statements, how do we know who the experts are if everybody can be an expert, but yet the people making the decisions still seem to don't know as much?
Real U.S. foreign policy is, despite public diplomacy, is carried out generally behind closed doors. It's a somewhat private enterprise. It's not inaccessible completely. So I want to make sure it's clear that what I was saying is that in the first 8 months of the administration, there have not been enough politically appointed mid-high level managers at the running the different bureaus overseeing the embassies around the world. That's very different from is there knowledge in the career diplomatic corps? There actually is tremendous knowledge. In my experience, there's tremendous knowledge all over the world. And what's missing, if you don't have that political leadership, is the people that are running the embassies in the closed, behind-the-scenes environment. They don't know what the parameters are of what it is that they can comfortably say to their counterparts. So, or let alone publicly, or say this is the established policy, because that's not their job. Their job is to enact the policy set by the White House. So this is a problem that needs to be fixed, and I don't see it being fixed as quickly as it needs to be, because instead what we have is not a debate about this in Washington foreign policy circles. What we have is a debate about how the new administration came in and has actually proposed about a 30% cut to State Department and USAID budgets, which are about this big compared to the defense budget, which is maybe the surface of the rug to the ceiling in size. So we're going to increase this defense budget, but we're actually going to make this smaller, and we're going to coincide that with an announcement of a major reorganization of how the State Department is run. This is big news in Washington. It doesn't seem to be big news around the world, and it's disconcerting. And the legislature, the committees overseeing the new administration's first budget, aren't happy about it.
There's a difference between policy and knowledge, too. Because the knowledge can exist there at all sorts. This is a gigantic bureaucracy. It can exist there at all sorts of levels. But policy is only generated at the very top. And so an example of, I think, the most egregious thing that's happened in the last 10 years is in 2013, Obama could have intervened in Syria with no more effort than what we currently have on the ground in Iraq and Syria, displaced the Assads, had a shot at holding the thing together as we did in Kosovo, Serbia, and whatever. That was the advice almost up and down the chain to him, where they had convinced both Mrs. Clinton and they had convinced Panetta. I can't remember who all was on board, but most of the staff was on board. And Obama walked out, talked to his advisors that had nothing to do with it, and decided he wasn't going to do it. And he only realized he had a problem when ISIS took Mosul in 2015. Good grief. This is what I go back to. At the very top, where the ultimate decision, I mean, even if the senior level you convince them, at the very top where the ultimate decisions are made, there's zero foreign policy experience.
But then we still run into the major problem is how does the region start expressing its views, its understandings to the U.S. administration in a way that's understood, usable. If things are behind closed doors, how do we get into those doors? Or should leaders in the region just pull a Trump? Just sit here and tweet like crazy and see what happens. See what's going on. We'll create our own policy through Twitter, which is a definite possibility as well. Right, I want to open it up to the audience. We have microphones on both sides. So who would like to get us going with this question? Ebtisam, please, here in the front.
Hello, I'm Ebtisam Al-Kitbi. I think we've met Alberto many times. From a think tank called Emirates Policy Center, also concerned with UAE foreign policy. Alberto, when you mentioned Qatar, there seems a puzzle for me that what all Qatar did, it seems that U.S. was blind regarding the rapprochement with Iran, which is now against Trump policy, connection with the ISIS or with the terrorist groups. It looks like a puzzle for me. So could you please try to clarify? Now, it seems to me there is two levels in the foreign policy of United States, that deep state and how much they are affecting U.S. foreign policy, deep state institution, I mean, CIA and Pentagon and DoD. And there is the White House level. Under Obama administration, it shows that the White House is taking the lead. Now, under Trump, it's not clear for me, and especially regarding the crisis with Qatar. And how can you convince me that we are allies of United States? And you mentioned that also. I do understand that Al-Udeid, whatever, that we are all serving U.S. interests. But these two things I cannot understand. Iran and the terrorist group, the Qatar connection. Please.
Well, I think one part of that is, Guy addressed it and others addressed it. There is a disconnect, I think, between a new White House leadership and those parts of governments that feed into and implement policy. There is a gap. There is a personnel gap and kind of mid-level to senior leadership people. And I think that has affected things. I don't think there's any doubt about that. On the other part, I mean, look, في نفاق سياسي في الغرب وفي الشرق. Why do I say that? All of the things that you mentioned about Qatar, which I believe to be true, can be said about other actors in the region and outside the region. So it's always a judgment call in foreign policy. Governments have their own interests, and our friends, and sometimes even our adversaries, they do things we like, they do things we don't like. And how do you judge them, right? What's more important? For example, let's take Qatar. I remember when I was in government many, many years ago, this is a long time ago, before all of this. It was actually 2006. And Al Jazeera used to have Hasuna Hassan Nasrallah on for hours, speaking, without interruption. And I remember having a discussion I was in the Near East Bureau with a Qatari official, and I said, how can you this is a terrorist, have this terrorist on without even analysis, without even commentary, you're just putting it on, and they said, well, but we have the U.S. Air Base, we do this. So you have a government, a friendly government, doing one thing we like and doing one thing we don't like. For someone who thinks media is important, they would say the media crime was much worse than the benefit of the base. But others would say it's the other way around, right? So it depends how you judge these things. You judge the totality of a relationship with the foreign policy of a friend or not even a friend, another country. What is the worst thing and what is the best thing? And as I said, if you're concerned about war, fighting a war in Afghanistan, possible war with North Korea, possible confrontation with Iran, the fact that Qatar is doing things which are annoying or irritating or bad, it's important for some people, and it's important for the United States. But it doesn't rise to the priority of those burning issues. So the challenge is to make clear why now, why these issues, why they're so significant. I think an argument can be made, but it hasn't been made as powerfully and as simply as should be made. There are other countries in the Gulf who have very good relations with Iran, not just Qatar, right? And so this needs to be explained, because if you're in Washington, if you're the deep state or outside of the deep state, you're going to say, well, wait a minute, the Iranians are here, the Iranians are there, and this is not good, but we're focusing on this. So I think this is the challenge, to explain it in very clear terms, why this is urgent. I used, with a journalist here, I used this term, we use in English, the tyranny of the urgent. Governments have a limited time and attention span, even great powers like the United States. في أولويات في السياسة الخارجية. And so this issue is important, but considering all the explosions, all the fires, all the disasters going on, it doesn't rise to the level of that. I mean, so it's very easy for the deep state or for professionals or for whoever to say, yes, this is a problem, but we'll deal with this later. We have these other more
urgent. But take up Guy's
things.
point with the influence of military now in the U.S. administration. Guy, how does the region explain the threats from the Muslim Brotherhood, from political Islam, from Qatar's support for extremism, when we have research that shows that these ideas turn into terrorism, counterterrorism turns into counterinsurgency, counterinsurgency turns into a war? We've seen the trajectories, but if they're military focused, how do we address it?
Let's talk about the Qatari issue. I've done the Gulf Brief for almost a dozen years. 2005, the two-page PowerPoint section on Qatar said that the Qataris recognize, I've talked to them. You ask them, why do you have such good relations with Iran? And you know what the answer was 15 years ago? Because you never know tomorrow who your friends are going to be. And you may need different friends. That's how practical they are, okay? And the brief 12 years ago was that Udaid, pre-positioned equipment, and a total free hand on operations. They call Udaid Ramstein East, okay? And the fact that the Qataris paid for it all was nothing more than an insurance policy. Yusuf Otaiba is using that term now in Washington, the insurance policy. And I'm not sure people actually understand it, but a tremendous amount of virtually do whatever we want to out of there because of that issue. And so I think when you get the military guys looking at it, they say, yeah, this other is a problem, but when it comes to interest, and this goes back to what I was saying, what is you consider an existential threat or interests can be, and often is at one level or another, very different from what we view, what the United States views as its interest in the region. A terrorist attack arising out of something causes a political firestorm. And so we're interested in terrorism. And I consider that a far more tactical, this domino theory of it growing. It did in the ISIS case, but when it got too big, we put it down. But terrorism still is a security, special operations, whatever mission on the thing. The existential threats to you, sometimes we don't grasp how important it is to you. And that's why I believe the Gulf states have to make it very clear. If something doesn't look right, if you've got words and no action, how what, if you will, and no action, you ought to ask a hard question if you think it's an existential issue to you.
See, but along those lines, this is interesting, guys. Curious in your views, what's happening in D.C. If we are talking to military guys, military-minded, how do you deal with these points that Roby just made? Here's what's happening on the ground. Here's the nature of the threat. I know you don't understand it. Let me explain it to you.
Yeah.
How do we do the explaining to the U.S.?
Well, look, I mean, first of all, when you're dealing with former generals who tend to be among the most worldly, book educated and life experience educated around, it's an incredible group. But if you leave diplomacy to them, generally what happens is nothing. It's that you don't deal with the problem. You don't. You protect your interest and you keep proceeding. So that's a problem we're facing right now. But in terms of trying to respond here to this idea of which threat is the United States and this new administration trying to focus on, is it Iran, rally all Arab states against that, or is it the shiny object of extremism, rally all states towards that? I think a little bit of both is happening, but I think what's important is to understand is that even these U.S. military characters, former U.S. military generals, they're not interested, and neither is the U.S. Foreign policy elite. They're not interested in promoting conflict. Despite perceptions in many parts of the world, and from my experience in the Middle East, this conspiracy idea that in fact the Americans are playing both sides and trying to foment, they're actually not. So if you're trying to decode why do we have friends on different sides and many friends in the region, because we don't know who our friend's going to be in 5 years. This is a slowly evolving
The U.S.
situation.
military isn't interested in more wars out there.
In more war. No, that's
No,
not-
they're absolutely
absolutely
not
not
interested. They're not
interested
interested
in
in a
war.
war with Iran, no matter what.
Right.
Okay? They're not interested, they weren't interested in intervention really in Syria. And that supported Obama's position of backing off. And now we have the Russians and all these problems, okay? But the U.S. military, there's a certain way you get promoted, and it's usually not in these little wars like this, and they just see it as a no-win game because all of the burden falls on them. If you go to Iraq and look at it, for the State Department to go out and have a meeting with someone, they had to have a convoy with 20 bodyguards and, and heavy weaponry and everything else to drive across town. And then you had that famous incident with Blackwater and in the Iraqi square. The State Department, for all its good intentions, has never been able to function very well in this environment. And when State Department officers did get killed, it caused years of congressional investigations in Libya. And so everything from the military's point of view falls on them. and they're tired of it.
Take the next question here on the right-hand side.
Thank you so much for the presenters, and thank you for Trends for organizing this important theme. My first question is to Alberto Fernandez. I want to elaborate on Dr. Ibtisam's question. There's a huge drift in the US between globalist and nationalist. And from what I see, that the globalists are more geared to the Qataris view, okay? So to what extent that will have an impact on the US foreign policy, especially towards the Qatari crisis? And my question also, what the boycotting countries, how they should improve their campaign in order to sound more credible to the Americans and to the Westerners? What they should be improving in their campaign? Like you mentioned about like how to make it a priority. And if Qatar is making already, for example, a relationship with Iran, you mentioned Gulf countries are making relationship with Iran. But the question, what type of relationship? We all know that the type of relationship for like a peaceful relationship and trade relationship with Iran is different than the Qatari relationship with Iran that is supporting militias and want to put those militias and extremists in power, like what we saw, for example, in Egypt and in Tunisia. So does the US administration doesn't see this as priority when you see the extremists that you're fighting are gonna be in power? Isn't that a threat? If like ordinary people are organizing that, are perceiving that, how come the US is not seeing that as a threat? And I don't want to talk a lot, but I have another question, if there is a possibility, to Dr. Ruby. My question that you brought up very important models in the Middle East region, but like it or not, even if secularism now is a taboo word, at the end, in order to establish stability in the region, the only way is to secularism. And I personally totally agree with the Emirati ambassador to the US when he mentioned about secularism. The problem with the US, it always focuses on abstract words, democracy, freedom of speech. But the problem, it doesn't give us a strategic planning how it could be implemented in the region, how you could implement such thing in a region that has a huge terrorism, instability, and illiteracy rate. You couldn't, like for example, get a 2-year-old kid to Harvard University. You should prepare him for that. Like for example, in France, it took them more than 150 years after the revolution to apply democracy. Why the US want just to apply democracy immediately over a sudden in the region? What kind of campaign, what kind of enlightenment should be happening before we talk about democracy?
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, I don't think there's any doubt that the majority of the kind of Washington consensus elite is, as I said, I don't think there's anyone that I'm aware of, there may be a handful, that is pro the misdeeds of Qatar. I think what you have in Washington, and this is outside the government as well as in some people inside, kind of in the think tank world or the elite world, is a realization that this is an issue, this is a problem, but it's not the problem. It's not the main problem. And even if links are problematical, you know, we're dealing with the disasters of the day, not the things that are going to happen tomorrow. There's just so much bandwidth and so much attention. And by the way, I mean, sounds cynical, but the sense is, I think, among the elite in Washington is that there are always others. This is not even a Gulf thing, it's in general. There are always others that want us to do things for them, right? You know, the Europeans want us to provide them defense, but they don't want to pay for it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Now, I understand the point that there's other things going on, and for the U.S., you do have to look around the world. But taking your earlier discussion, and both other speakers have hit on it, of the immediacy problem.
Yeah.
Get that. But equally, what about longer term planning? Or am I just talking really bizarre words right now? When it comes to foreign policy, how much longer term planning, if we address the Qatar support of funding extremism right now, funding of terrorism, and this is funding that's going to Al Qaeda, supposedly the US's biggest enemy in the world.
Yeah.
So there is an immediacy problem tied here as well, I believe. How can we convince government to say, look, you need to address not only the immediate, but you need to start working on these things until it blows up? Because these guys just said, military doesn't want to see war. So let's try to deal with the problem before it turns into a war.
Yeah, but the thing is, all these things turn into, I mean, all of these things lead to something. I mean,
very positive,
let's be
Alberto.
blunt. No, let's be blunt here. I mean, is it Qatar, and I'm an open critic of the Qataris, is it Qatar who has funded, supported the growth of Islamist extremist discourse over the last 20, 30, 40 years? Yes and no. It's Qatar and a half dozen other countries and non-countries, individuals, private sector. You know, as I often say, the Salafi jihadist or Islamist movement, which is very broad and diverse and diffuse movement, was fabricated. It didn't just happen bisadfi. It happened because individuals, governments, organizations invested in ideology and books and training and Sharia and this and in that. It wasn't all Qatar. It was a whole bunch of people. And by the way, not just in the Middle East. Some of them were people who were living in London or living in Washington or wherever, right? So when you talk about the factors that lead to the disasters that we have today, it doesn't come from one source. It comes from a multitude of sources. Let's take the Muslim Brotherhood. What happened? The Muslim Brotherhood were kicked out of Egypt by Nasser, and where did they go? They went to the Gulf and were here for decades. They for decades were here, and for decades they were influential in the educational system and in the creation of Gulf states, not a state, but states. At some point, people realized we have a problem. We have a problem.
Well, you know, in that regard too, Alberto, if you look at the problem that the Gulf, particularly the monarchies, had with radical Arab nationalism, Nasserism, it was the same thing. Everybody had Egyptian teachers and everything else in the thing. There was no screening. And so suddenly in Riyadh, you have this groundswell of support in the late 50s and everything. And this idea that, you know, Nasser was the wave of the future, et cetera, et cetera. And so, and that's not the fault of anybody, because what we don't see is we try to do the best we can at modernizing, okay? And sometimes things happen that we can't see the consequences of, and so you create a problem. But I go back to this.
Before we do that, Roby, Guy, did you have something you wanted to add to Alberto's comments?
I was going to make the argument with regard to achieving more U.S. government and U.S. foreign policy establishment understanding of a particular foreign government's motivations, fears, and desires. I think the best way that it can be facilitated is actually through civil society. And there are a few think tanks here in the Emirates. This isn't the only one. But the civil society here, the civil society in the United States is, this is something I always tell visitors who come. It's, there's many things that you could get there, but the one thing to understand that it's hard to wrap your head around is how absolutely vast that civil society is. Thousands of universities, think tanks, media outlets, interest groups, lobbyists, all of these elements. But there's actually a missing piece to that civil society in this increasingly globalized, fast communications world. And that missing piece is the presence within it of foreign civil society institutions, just like this think tank. there's a hunger for it in Washington. There are several establishment foreign policy outlets outside of the lobbying and money-making realm, just the ideas realm. Let's shape really good ideas that we know lots of people can agree on. There are several big establishment think tanks that are eager to partner with the, and this is a new phenomenon. This is like, I've watched it in the last 10 years. These new voices in civil society institutions pop up. And so I would advocate more of that.
Right.
And it's not just from this region. The blossoming of civil society is still happening very slowly in several regions of the world. And this is something the United States should be encouraging, and it should be, in fact, because the end result, just to finish, to bring it back to what is that if more people in the U.S. foreign policy establishment will then be able to actually hear from the real source.
Yeah.
And possibly even a diversity of views from the real source of whatever foreign.
And that takes to the question to you, Roby, that we see the U.S. foreign policy using these abstract terms, and that's it. They just sort of leave it at the term, whereas, the civil society can help us with the practice. I mean, how do we sort of overcome that element, or how do we improve that element, instead of just throwing out nation state, democracy, this stuff? Let's have some practical examples, experiences.
When you look at U.S. foreign policy, you look at the think tanks, okay, for example, on the issue of the Muslim Brotherhood, there's considerable numbers of experts that believe that we should have opposed the military coup that replaced the Muslim Brotherhood, whether they were elected or not, whether they would in the end have been democratic or not, that was a travesty, that now supporting the CC government and working with them, that the Muslim Brotherhood wasn't elected. And this is what I'm going back to telling you. What I was trying to say is there are these Western conceptions that we bring along with us, that democracy is good no matter what, that civil government as we see it is good no matter what, that if you replaced an elected government, no matter how it got elected or what the problems were in Egypt, then you've done something that's wrong. And so there is this undercurrent there. And it's because there is a propensity in the West, but particularly among Americans. It's idealistic, but it's also born of ignorance of other cultures, et cetera, to view democracy as good, anything that's not democracy is bad, and if you're developing, then you're moving toward a democratic model, no matter what prosperity is occurring, no matter what stability, et cetera, et cetera. And that is I feel like this is something I've been battling for 20 years. Myself, I say you have to look at people within the context of their own culture. You have to understand what the Muslim Brotherhood is. The difference, there was going to be an authoritarian government in Egypt no matter what happened, ultimately. And it's simply because that's the way the place is run for 5,000 years. That's the way it's always run. So the question is, do you want that to be a military regime that's quasi-Western, and oh, by the way, moving more to burnish its Islamist credentials too with their projects at Al-Azhar and other places? Or do you want it to be the Muslim Brotherhood, which is ideologically anti-Western and destabilizing for the rest of the region, very much like radical Arab nationalism in the 50s and 60s? But this is a really pretty sophisticated argument to lay out to these people, and I promise you, John Doe in Liberty, Kansas is not going to understand it. Yeah. And a lot of people, when it generates, a lot of the representatives in Congress aren't going to understand it. It goes down the whole thing. So the issue is, it comes back to this. You have to look at your interests. Look at U.S. policy and where you think it's going. Don't listen to the words. Look at what happened. And then you have to say, hey, wait a minute. We're allies. We've been allies. We've got a problem with it. And we need to sit down and talk about it. Otherwise, you'll get that, well, you know, we've got this priority and that priority, et cetera. I think the more the Gulf states make what they consider their, and you can't overuse this, but make what they consider their existential interest our problem, then the better hearing you're going to get on this. In Iraq, that whole democracy thing was utterly stone cold, ridiculous, born of idealism that had no basis in reality.
Yeah, absolutely. Right, there was a question in the back, I believe. Gentleman way in the back.
Thank you very much. I'm Patrick Bell from the National Defense College. I want to make a comment and then a question. My comment was this. Each one of the presenters, I enjoyed all of your presentations. I think you made very interesting points, and I would try to link them together in this way, making an analogy from physics. Essentially, what we're dealing with here in terms of Twitter, in terms of the context, in terms of what's going on diplomatically, is that two things are happening. Distance and speed are affected by what? Time. And what's happened is that the time we have to react, the time we have to make decisions has been shortened by social media. We need to take into account, the impact of this context. But what has affected time? And this is my question to each one of you. I think it's technology, whether it's social media, what is your advice to leaders in the region or even leaders in the United States of how to deal with this new technology and in particular its effect on time and how you make decisions?
Okay, great. I'll state this question in the front as well, please.
Basmala Tribi, Future Center for Advanced Research and Studies in Abu Dhabi. First, I'd like to thank all the panelists for such a rich discussion and for offering the U.S. perspective. We haven't had such questions from the Gulf perspective till now, but as an Egyptian researcher, I have some comments and quick questions. For Ambassador Fernandez, you said that foreign policy is more or less pragmatic in this sense. The U.S. won't pose or won't think of Gulf interests as the problem unless we make it their problem or make it U.S. problem. How do we make it so? Whether it's Gulf or as an Egyptian, whether it's an Egyptian interest, how do we make it U.S. interests, U.S. problems? To Dr. Robbie, you said that the socio-cultural context and the socio-economic context, the backgrounds are very important to understand what's happening now in the Gulf. The image and the photos that you presented of Yemen and how Yemen should be, or how we should portray or think of Yemen. So what's the answer to the Yemeni problem then? So that's my question to you. And to Guy, as I previously worked in NDI in Cairo and our office got raided. And I do not recommend, with all due respect, Americans saying that civil society should be empowered without taking into consideration the local context and the government perspective on things. I was safe. I was in the US visiting family, so I wasn't caught in anything. I have friends who got caught up in this and suffered for years. So there should be understandings of local and regional context to say so. And as you said, the problem with media and social media, but media in today's America is not on the good side of Trump and his followers. You said, Dr. Robbie, you said John Doe in Nebraska or wherever does not care about what's happening in the rest of the world or if he has a say on things. So since you are not on the good side of Trump and his current administration, how do you see things going forward? Do you think that lobbyists should focus more on making the U.S. administration view things differently, or view things regardless of having Twitter posts as soon as possible? Okay, that's been a joke, but nothing is changing. Nothing has been changing for the past 8 months. So what should be done? And social media has been portrayed to be weaponized for the past 2 years by ISIS, and there's a very interesting article by The Atlantic on this posted last year. But so what? What to do about it? These are my 3 questions for all the panelists. Thank you very much.
Thanks. I mean, both the rounds of questions are touching on the key themes or hitting on this immediacy issue, the speed issue by which things both happen. At the same time, you guys are all pointing to that we need to understand the local context much better. The locals' context needs to understand the U.S. much better, which takes time. So any suggestions, any words of wisdom on how we balance speed with the necessity of depth and time?
Well,
Okay.
first, to the first question from the back about physics.
Big Bang Theory generation.
What's that?
Big Bang Theory generation.
Well, no, I immediately started writing down distance and speed. I think that my really basic response to that is that government has to get serious about having a strategy for social media. Its own strategy about how it's going to use it, how the individuals in power are going to use it or not. And so it's pretty basic. Have a strategy, and then in that strategy could be to aggressively not use it as well. And if you are going to use it, don't just use it to say nothing. Use it to say something. I mean, let's remember there are examples of governments that China, Russia don't allow Facebook. So not only are they having an aggressive internal strategy towards how officials use it or don't use it, they're actually not even allowing that American technology. So that's it. Yeah.
All right, cool. Ruby.
On the speed issue,
Speed and understanding. I mean,
well, John Doe out in Kansas voted for Trump so that Trump would withdraw from the Gulf and Afghanistan and everything else. Trump is going to take a beating over Afghanistan because 2,000-3,000 troops is not going to make any difference one way or another. We're going to have the same thing we've always had. I have a theory about Afghanistan and Yemen. There's a great crack in a book, Robert Burroughs. It says Yemen and Afghanistan are more alike than either are like any other place in the world. So we could put 1 million troops in Afghanistan and try to pacify it. When we withdrew them 500 years from now, it'd go back to being Afghanistan, right? Get my point? Same with Yemen. And so I think on the speed thing, I think that what the population doesn't, the U.S. population, maybe they could be re-educated, but I don't think so. I think that what happens is someone like Trump comes to the White House with some real simple ideas about what's going to happen, and just like on healthcare, he says, wow, this is really complicated. Okay, so there's this, when I speak, and I speak all over the country, but when I speak, there's all these people talking about our fracking and us being energy independent. And I have to say, have you people lost your mind? Okay, it is a global market. If instability affects the Gulf and remove Gulf oil from the market, you're still going to be paying $5 a gallon. And Exxon, whether it's a U.S. company or not, it's not going to give you a special deal at $2.50. Okay, and so part of it is this very difficult problem of understanding how. You may not like it, but we're globalized, and we have interests that we share. And we have all these differences that sometimes we get very, very upset about. But we have an overall interest in the stability and security of the Gulf. That's the only interest that the United States has in Yemen, whoever asked the Yemen question, okay? So when I look at what's happened here, the United States actually sponsored the 1994 conquest of Sunni Yemen by the Zaidi regime in Sana'a under Saleh. We supported it, we supplied it. Hadi was one of the key guys that got people in the south to do it. They basically sacked Aden, et cetera, et cetera. Saudi Arabia and other states in the Gulf said, really, this is not what you want to see. And so I think when confronted with the problem in Yemen of 2015, and suddenly you're going to see a reconquest of the south in the areas by the Zaidi north, I think the UAE and Saudi Arabia did the only thing they could do, and that is prevent it. that said, look, Yemen is just not this core of corrupt military officers. It's this, it's a much bigger thing. And so, but if you expect it to be tied up in a nice bow and fixed, that map should dissuade you from that. But I don't see that you have any choice but to intervene. When I'm asked about Syria or Iraq, ISIS, the Alawite regime, I was in Amman, Jordan, and had to watch what happened in Hama in 1982. Okay? I knew what these people would do. And so I watched this, and I'm heart sick that we didn't act in 2013. It's on a scale to me of what happened in Rwanda. I'm heart sick about it. But when I look at it, and they say, well, but there's no solution. That's right. There's no solution where suddenly it's peace and light, et cetera, but I'm telling you, that just because there's no solution doesn't mean you can't get involved and try to establish some kind of equilibrium that more people benefit from. That's the situation we face, and I believe that's the situation you face in Yemen. Yeah. And I don't see that you've really got any choice. You asked me what the more important problem is right now for the Gulf. If I had to choose between Qatar and Yemen, I'll take Yemen every time. Because of what it means.
Before that opens a different discussion, I just want to go to you, Alberto. You're somebody who has served in the field, as it were, and you've seen the immediacy of the situation. We have to do something. But you've also been back in D.C. looking at that much bigger picture. So the messages coming from the field, well, they're important, but they're not that important. How do we see the balancing up of this so that the friends, the allies on the ground know the U.S. is listening in some way, may act?
Well, one thing you need to factor in, I mentioned it in my remarks, is the heritage of the last 20 or so years. The trauma in the United States of the expenditure of blood and treasure to try to fix things in the region, which some may disagree, but the U.S. would say basically we're not problems of our own creation. And so, the sense is that this is a region full of problems that have not really been fully addressed in the region, and there's a deep skepticism when people appeal to Washington. You need to do this. Why do we need to do this? Why us? Go to Moscow. Have the Moscows, beat up on have the Russians beat up on the Qataris or something. Okay. So there's deep skepticism in Washington as a result of the last, since 9/11 and even before, the expenditure of blood and treasure and angst, which didn't really solve anything. It's one thing to spend a lot of blood and treasure and get a result. But you spent a lot and you didn't get a result. You're right. Afghanistan is basically, it's a rat hole. The solution that the West, the United States built in Afghanistan is dependent on checks being written by the West to keep the situation intact in Afghanistan. Okay. So you have to kind of justify why now, why should we do this? Because the end result has been not that good.
Okay, useful. Now, we're running over a bit of time, and I'm standing between you and lunch. So I'm just going to take a couple of last round of questions. There's a gentleman here. Yeah.
صباح الخير. اسمحوا لي أسأل السؤال باللغة العربية. هو الحقيقة سؤال ممكن تبقى الإجابة عليه نوع من أنواع التلخيص لما تم ذكره من نقاشات ومن أسئلة في الندوة. هو هقرا سؤال زي ما كتبته وزي ما كنت متوقعة إني هحصل على إجابات أو بدون سؤال في البداية. إنه أخذا في الاعتبار إن منطقة الشرق الأوسط ومنطقة الخليج بتمر بمرحلة تحول عميقة جدا، ما هي الصورة المستقبلية المحتملة للشرق الأوسط ومنطقة الخليج بصفة خاصة، وإلى أي مدى هناك توافق بين الرؤية الأمريكية والخليجية حول مستقبل المنطقة؟ وإيه هي الأدوات السياسية وغير السياسية التي ستستخدمها الولايات المتحدة لدعم الصورة المرغوبة للشرق الأوسط؟ وما هو دور الخليج في دعم هذه الأدوات وما هو مدى التحول في الأدوات المستخدمة من الولايات المتحدة في المرحلة الحالية والمستقبلية عما هو حدث في الماضي. شكرا.
Let me thank you for your presentation, insightful presentations, insightful discussions that add value for us. And let me first express that I can pretend that I understand the culture of US and as well the culture of the Gulf countries. So I'm not going in details about this area. But my question is on Iran. Many questions have raised in my mind, but I think we haven't the luxury of time consuming in a way. So my question is about Iran. Across the history of, across the journey of the history, starting actually from 1979, the US administrations haven't achieved any kind of victory against Iran's interest. Do you think that there is now such kind of Iranophobia in US administrations? Or it is stemming out of robust Iranian lobbies within the US administrations, or it is just a game of interest?
Okay.
Thank you.
Great, thanks. And one here in the front, please.
Thank you very much. Michael Patrick Joyce. I'm a non-resident fellow with Trends Institution Research and Advisory. I'd like to pick up on a word which Guy used more than once in the course of his presentation, which was dialogue, and apply that to some of the things that Alberto and Roby were saying in the course of their presentations. Because Alberto, you talked about the need for an enlightened Muslim, Arab solution, which in essence is talking about the creation of a community. It may be an amorphous community, it may be an intellectual community, but it's a community. Roby, you were also talking about a different type of community. You were talking about a failed community through the Westphalian state model. But when one looks at communities in the 21st century, there are many other models, there are many different varying models. So within the UAE, there is a strong sense of community in each emirate. There is a strong sense of national federal community. There's a strong sense of regional community. You've got business communities, professional communities, familial links, tribal links, and increasingly social media communities where they may be good communities, but they may also be bad communities. So that part of the challenge, and also this is bringing back the power of dialogue, may be to engage and promote and enhance the good communities at the same time as diminishing the effect of the bad communities. And it seems to me that therefore dialogue and engagement is going to be very important, increasingly so. Okay. Because either you have no engagement with bad communities, you have engagement with bad communities and they're found wanting, you have engagement with bad communities and they actually have an argument which is superficially attractive, at which point we need to use Alberto's comment to think in the same way as the revolutionaries in order to up our own game. So really, I'd invite the panel to comment further about the power of dialogue in the context of the present discussion.
All right, one final quick question from the gentleman in the back there, please.
الإعلام الغربي والأمريكي بالذات كان أكثر جرأة في التعاطي مع الأزمة القطرية، بل وبعض الكتاب أثبتوا تورط قطر بالدعم الغير مباشر وبعض الحالات المباشر للإرهاب. الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية هي زعيمة العالم في محاربة الإرهاب، بل واجترت العالم في عدة تحالفات في أفغانستان وفي العراق لمحاربة الإرهاب. لماذا لم تتعاطى الولايات المتحدة مع الرواية الدول الأربعة بطلب فتح تحقيق مع قطر بدعمها للإرهاب حتى هذه اللحظة؟ هل لو كانت الدولة المعنية غير قطر مثلا الصومال أو كينيا لكان الموقف الولايات المتحدة هو الدبلوماسية العالية؟ وشكرا.
Right, great way to wrap it up. I'm going to put the challenge to you guys. You got 5 minutes to address community dialogue, what tools from the U.S., and in particular, Iran and Qatar problems.
I'll go first. One of the questions was about the U.S. view, the establishment view towards the GCC internal crisis. And I think that from who I'm talking to, which is a pretty wide variety on both sides, politically, ideologically, inside the U.S. establishment, there's this feeling that it's going to, there's a hope it's not going to escalate more. And there's a feeling that it's going to blow over somehow. It's actually going to de-escalate. It's just that's a feeling. The second one, unless I really want to jump in on this, that with regard to dialogue, it forces, when you bring together the two sides, and you know, it could be considered ironic that an American is talking about dialogue. In America's political system at the moment, there's a lot of endless amount of whining about the lack of dialogue between the two leading political parties. But when you bring different sides together in this hyper social media environment, it forces both sides to think a lot about what it is that they really want to say. And that's important because in this age of hyperspeed technology, react right now. Don't respond carefully. It's really important to get people to think very deeply about what they say. Of course, it runs the risk that the level of self-censorship that will go on to achieve some kind of a dialogue without a fist fight or violence, that's there, and you can end up with a banal exchange. I still think it's incredibly worth it, and I think that it fits into something that there was a woman over here who had a question about. Yeah, it was about civil society, and I would love to chat with you afterwards with regard to NDI and what went on there. Because of it, as far as media and how does media interact with a government in Washington that's really combative towards the media, criticizing it constantly. I don't have a technological magic wand solution for this, but it's more of a human, be a grown-up and a mature participant in human exchange. And as that might be so obvious that it sounds ridiculous, I'm sorry, it needs to be said, particularly when you look at the demographics around the world, in the United States, especially in the Levant and the Maghreb and the Gulf. You're talking about massive numbers of very young people. It needs to be said. Read more deeply. The U.S. press corps needs to work harder at not settling for the same tactics being thrown at them by the new people in power. Ask the question more deeply. Ask it again. Ask it again. Don't resort to some sort of angry posturing on social media and television so quickly. But sure.
Turn to you, Alberto. I mean, we hear radical changes. We're hearing for different levels of action against particular actors where you can actually identify the threat, the problem. But where do we find the time in the space of radical change to think more deeply, to consider these things more, to have dialogue, not just with our partners or with our enemies?
Well, I think you have to exercise a certain amount of discipline in seeing the big picture. Look, GCC states in general, and the UAE in particular, are relatively well run, relatively relatively decent, good societies, governments that are relatively functional. But GCC states are part of a broader region which is in deep crisis. And the building blocks of that is the building blocks of all the violence and dysfunction that we see are still there. They're relatively untouched region-wide. So one of the dangers of many of the things we discuss, which are serious things, they're serious immediate things, is that we miss the forest for the trees. This overall general crisis of the region, a crisis of governance, a crisis of authority, a crisis of the future. What does it mean to be an Arab Muslim, not a Gulf Arab, but in the region? What does that mean? What type of governance? What type of future? What type of political, social, economic reality is going to shape this rapidly growing, unhappy, unsettled population? Those issues are not being addressed. I was recently at a conference in Beirut, and a very good regional analyst, an Arab guy who's a friend of mine, was talking about these issues, and I said, well, how are you going to fix these things? How are you going to address these things? And he said, well, we expect you to lead. And I said, U.S. is not going to solve these issues, right? The U.S. is not going to solve the issues of millions of angry or unhappy or dissatisfied people who want to do something. What that is, what that solution is something that is going to come from the region. And so we need to not be distracted by these immediate crises of today, but look at these larger social forces that are moving the region in a certain direction.
And Roby, that goes right back to your original point about using some of these abstract terms. If we don't have dialogue, if we're not identifying the radical changes, we may lose some of the gains we are experiencing if the U.S. continues to not see the forest or the trees, or does not listen to the region. So any sort of operational advice?
I tend to be really practical and down to earth. I've seen too much in 40 years out here. And in general, after you have a dialogue, sometimes you figure out you never liked the guy in the first place and you disagree with him. Doesn't help a thing. This Obama idea that we just sit down and reason together, the community organizer, that everything will be okay, that really the Assads will see the error of their ways and quit slaughtering and not slaughter 250,000 Sunnis. Okay? They hate each other. And the Assads will do anything to maintain their grip on power. They don't care who dies. And sometimes you have to do something about that. Okay? Here's what I think. I think we all have a context that we were born into and we grew up in. And I think that your context here in the Gulf, Bahrain's got problems because of the Shia Al Khalifa trade-off. Qatar was born in conflict with Abu Dhabi and Manama and survived by balancing Riyadh off against the Turks and the British. Okay? Born. The Al Thani weren't the recognized power, 1868. And this has been the history of the Al Thani position there. Am I surprised that there's a real problem with the Al Thani and that they're causing problems? No. And they're using terrible judgment on all sorts of issues. But it's the nature of the relationship. But here's what I'll say about the Gulf. You have a certain context, you have a certain history, you have a certain sociocultural milieu that you put together something that's prosperous and functions and works. I believe that monarchy, because the ruler, be he an emir, a sultan, or a king, is the defender of the faithful. And it gives him the flexibility to reach out beyond the narrow group. He doesn't have to be Saddam Hussein and totally slaughter one group and suppress one group in order to rule through another. He can step beyond it. Oh, by the way, what happened in Iraq in 1958, I'm a pretty good student of, because that's what my first publication was on. And it was an accident. If there were still a monarchy in Iraq, it would be balancing things just like the Hashemite monarchy is in Jordan, but you wouldn't have had what's happened. And so I think we have to look inside ourselves and our own cultural experience, and we have to look to our own interests. And I think when you look to your interests and I look to what I think our interests are, I think there's a tremendous amount of synergy there that's created this Gulf security system to survive for 250 years. And I think what we need in the form of dialogue is a little blunt talk from you to us on what your priorities are and what you expect, and us to you honestly on where we think we are and what's going on. I don't think it's slapping we love each other. I think, friends, who said this? Turki bin Faisal said this about 8 or 9 years ago. And, he's a character. I mean, I first met him probably 35 years ago. But he said this, he said, sometimes friends owe it to friends to be blunt and tell them really what they think about things. And I think it's important for the Emirates in particular. There was a survey of youth, the Arab youth, and they asked what is your model for what the world ought to be. They didn't say democracy, they didn't say this. They said their model for what a state ought to be is the United Arab Emirates. This is the IPSCO thing. And I had to write a thing that went to the UN on it, taking all of the factors into play. And I think that what you have developed is unique, and you need to keep perfecting it. But I think that when you look at it, you need to start asking your allies when you think there's a real issue.
Okay.
We've got a difference here. That's what dialogue is about to me.
Absolutely.
So,
thanks for that. Let's end it on a positive note. Let's not bring the negatives into it, but we'll end it there. I mean, I'm not sure we've covered the inconsistencies. I'm not sure we got to the bottom of the confusion, but I want to thank the speakers for making the message very clear that it's up to us here in the region to make it clear to others on what needs to be done and not sit around waiting or complaining or other things. And that's a big task, there's no doubt, but we have your support, we have the resources here, and we have everybody here today that can help with that. I want to thank you all for attending. Lunch is available for everybody just outside. Please join us. You'll be able to talk to the speakers some more and pick their brains a bit more. But I very much want to thank Roby, Alberto, and Guy for joining us today. We certainly appreciate you. Please join me in thanking them. Thank you, everybody. That concludes our event today.